Welcome to the session, Are We Teaching Political History? I'm the chair, Antoinette Burton, from the Department of History at the University of Illinois. Before we launch into discussion of the provocative question of the roundtable, a few words on how we all got here. Right before Labor Day 2016, two of our panelists, Fred Logevall of Harvard University and Ken Osgood of the Colorado School of Mines, posted an op-ed in the New York Times, which bemoaned the decline of the teaching of political history, something they define as, quote, a specialization in elections and elected officials, policy and policymaking, parties, and party politics. And they bemoaned this decline of teaching political history in American colleges and universities. Perhaps they knew it, but these turned out to be fighting words, and the blogosphere went crazy on all sides of the political aisle, as the binary saying goes. Meanwhile, in a galaxy far, far away, actually in Champaign, Urbana, where I teach, I happened to run into my colleague, Leslie Reagan, who was her fair share of agitated about the post, as she will detail in a moment. Because I know that the AHA, and specifically its executive director, Jim Grossman, is very keen to have the annual meeting program be as topical as possible, and because as next year's AHA program chair, I have his ear at the moment, I floated the idea of a panel that directly engaged the question of the op-ed. And thanks to the willingness and quick responses of our panelists, not to mention some fast footwork by Debbie Doyle at the AHA, it squeaked onto the program just before the printer's deadline. We recruited Marsha Barrett of Mississippi State University and Michael Kazin of Georgetown in order to help us create a panel in which we and you, the audience, could genuinely debate the issues raised by Logevall and Osgood's salvo. In the meantime, Fred and Kenneth have engaged in dialogue with Mark Stein, the Jamie and Phyllis Pasker Professor of U.S. History at San Francisco State, as he argued for the history of sexuality and immigration law as legitimate sites of political history. You can read their exchange, if you haven't already, in the January issue of the AHA's Perspectives magazine, along with an introduction to that dialogue by Allison Miller, the Perspectives editor. So here we are at the intersection of headline news and historical debate, albeit in the last Sunday morning slot of the conference. If Jim Grossman were here, he'd certainly want me to say that this closes a particular narrative arc that has run through the conference and helped to give it shape as a whole. So our panel links backwards to the plenary on the first 100 days of the new administration and what historians have to say about that. It also connects to a session on Friday that was called The Political Authority of Historians, which similarly takes off from the controversial op-ed in the New York Times by Stanley Fish called Historians Against Trump. And of course, it anticipates the 2018 annual meeting, whose theme is Race, Ethnicity, and Nationalism in Global Perspectives, which convenes a year from now in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you'll agree that that theme has a very historically specific ring to it, which, like all good history, points us to the past, the present, and the future all at once. So without further ado, we'll open with Professors Logevall and Osgood briefly summarizing the original op-ed and the ensuing coverage thereof. Their remarks will be limited to 10 minutes maximum. Each panelist will then offer 5 minutes of reflection on the variety of issues raised by the editorial and the debates it's generated. And given, as I've said to them, given the diversity of institutional locations they're all speaking from, local contexts as well as national trends will no doubt be important, and I trust also that will be the case in the Q&A that comes from the audience. So we'll then open the floor for discussion, and hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for conversation. So with that, we'll begin with Fred.
So Ken and I are going to tag team a little bit, and I'll make a few remarks about what we sought to do with this op-ed way back in late August, and then he'll talk a little bit about the discussion since. And I want to say up front that the answer to this question before us this morning is yes, we're still teaching political history. Our editor at the New York Times is very good at his job, or at least good from his perspective. He knows a good headline when he chooses it. I believe it was, "Why did we stop teaching political history?" He thought that this headline would draw readers in, as effective titles should do, and indeed it did. Within a few hours, there were some 500 reader comments on the comment site on the Times, and then they shut down the reader comments. This was, I think, at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So it generated what, from his perspective, was what he wanted, which was discussion. And indeed, it's what we wanted as well. But Ken and I know full well that political history is being taught at small and large institutions across the country. These lights.
I know.
Just, they're
Yeah.
with your permission, I'll strip down just a
Yes,
little.
absolutely.
So, we know full well that political history is being taught all across the country by talented and dedicated teachers who care a lot about the subject. We know that several institutions have history departments that indeed can boast, rightly, a genuine depth in political history, a particular strength in terms of faculty specialization in U.S. political history. Moreover, we're well aware of a lot of innovative and important research that is being done, has been done, will continue to be done. Ken and I regularly assign these books, by some people I think who are in this room, to our students. And in fact, in an early draft of the piece that was significantly longer when we first submitted, we have the following quote, or we note in this early draft, and I want to quote, the extremely important studies in recent years on topics such as the politics of mass consumption, Southern black politics, grassroots conservatism, and the rise of the political right. We now wish, needless to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, that we had insisted on keeping that particular sentence in the final version, if necessary, by cutting something else. So what then is the problem? Well, I guess our point is this. There is excellent work being done both on the teaching and research side. There's just not enough of it. That's what I think led us to pursue this and to write this piece. Too few colleges and universities have people who self-identify as political historians. Course offerings in U.S. political are often slim. And I say that even though I recognize, of course, and Ken recognizes, that a lot of courses that may not have political in the title nevertheless devote significant attention in the course to that subject. And I think Ken may come back to this a little bit. And of course, as I said, a handful of departments are truly excellent in political history and have a strength in it. But this is a very large country. And 6 or 8 or 10 history departments with a concentration in political history do not a healthy field make. On the research side, our concern is that the new political history, which has done a great deal to enliven the historiography, there's no question about this. Our concern is that it can represent not just a broadening of political history, but in fact a narrowing, in which what we call, for lack of a better phrase, high politics is too often missing or underplayed. By the way, parenthetically, this is a point that I've also made about the new international history, which has become a juggernaut in the field of U.S. foreign relations history. International history is enriching the field in many, many ways. I consider myself an international historian, but very often it has come to exclude considerations of state-to-state relations, top-level decision-making, diplomatic negotiations, and questions of war and peace. So there's an interesting parallel discussion one can have about both what we used to call diplomatic history and military history that I think goes along with political history. Contrary to what a critic says in the current issue of the AHA Perspectives, we're not interested in being gatekeepers. Far from it. We're not interested in being imperialistic. But as we say in our response in Perspectives, if we're opting for a capacious domain for the political, let's make sure it's truly inclusive, with a full and robust attention also paid to history from above, to high politics, to those who have held predominant power in American society, that is to say presidents, Congress, state governments, the elections that brought them to office, and the formulation and impact of policies that resulted from the exercise of that power. It seems to us, and to a great many people who responded positively to the op-ed, that while in our daily lives we take these manifestations of politics for granted. In our dinner parties, I'm sure all of us spend a lot of time talking about, again, high politics in quotes. But too often it seems to Ken and me, we lose sight of this in our research, at least pre-tenure, and that's a discussion we could have. and in our decision-making on matters of curriculum design and faculty hiring. For 2+ decades, I've seen countless graduate students steered away from pursuing dissertation topics dealing with, again, high politics, with elections, with the presidency, the Congress, congressional executive relations, etc. I think I understand some of the reasons for that. In fact, I myself have steered graduate students away from those topics. Some of these reasons I think are worthy, and we can discuss them. I'm sure we will. But any way you slice it, my point, our point, is that something is lost in the process. We've ceded too much of this ground to our colleagues in political science and American political development, and that's a problem we argue. So what I want to stress, and what Ken and I want to stress, and then I'm going to turn it over to him, is that we're not arguing. I want to be very clear about this. We're not arguing for a return to the march of the president's political history of the past. Nobody would want that, or few at least would advocate that. But presidents and other political elites ought to be part of any holistic treatment of the subject. That's all we're suggesting. And we also want to suggest that those who choose to focus on, if you will, a top-down approach should not have to apologize for doing so. That was the genesis of the op-ed, I think, and I look forward to further discussion. But Ken, the floor is yours.
Let me just quickly say thanks to our panelists for joining us for the celebrity roast, or the lack of celebrity roast as it may be. I think it's safe to say that both Fred and I were pleasantly surprised and in fact blown away by the responses to our op-ed. We had hoped to spark a conversation. That's why we wrote it for the Times, but I don't think either of us anticipated that we would have made quite the splash we did. And maybe that's due to the headline that Fred mentioned. But I think it's fundamentally great because it shows that we as a community are taking the issue seriously. And so I want to just briefly touch on some of the responses we received. And as Fred mentioned, there are so many, and we ourselves spent literally a week exchanging emails with about 100 people. So it's difficult to summarize it all, but let me make a few observations. First is, I think it's pretty safe to say that the responses were polarized. The initial reaction was either Fred and Ken are dead on, or that Fred and Ken were dead wrong. And there's something to both sides, and our critics have made some really good points, and I'm sure we'll hear more shortly. And obviously the situation's more complex than our 800-word op-ed allowed. But I would ask people here to consider this proposition. If many of our colleagues say that we are dead on, that we're right, then logically we must conclude that we cannot be dead wrong. Because what our colleagues are saying is that they do not perceive a supportive, welcoming, and inclusive environment for doing political history in all its forms. And if this is the case, then things cannot be quite so alive and well as one of our critics put it. Because that perception is part of the reality, and it must come from somewhere. And so our task going forward is to acknowledge it and address it. So beyond this general observation, let me highlight 3 other trends in the responses: the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, the good. Where we've gotten pushback, it has generally been to say, we are doing political history, things aren't as bad as Logevall and Osgood claim, it's alive and well. But what is really encouraging in all of the responses we saw is that every respondent accepted our general premise that American political history is important and it needs to be part of our teaching and scholarship. So this is good news. It suggests that there may be more widespread acceptance of the value of doing political history than Fred and I assumed, or that many of our supporters perceive. And this suggests that we're in a good position to move the conversation forward and turn to the future. Now to the bad. A few commentators asserted that we painted too dim, too grim a picture of the job market for political historians. In the current issue of Perspectives, Mark Stein asserts, without any evidence of his own, I should point out, that we actually made false claims about the academic job market for political historians. But if you follow the footnote trail and the social media threads, you'll discover that his critique relies on 2 blogs that themselves rely on 2 tweets. One was a tweet by the AHA's Jim Grossman, who graciously hosted us today, listing the number of jobs advertised by the AHA. And the other was a tweet of a graph that appeared in Perspectives a couple years ago. The latter source we had examined, but didn't end up using that particular data because it tracks all historians who study by a given specialty, not just those who are Americanists, which was our primary concern. This points to some other problems. Both these data sources relied on different methodology than Fred and I used. In addition to the chart I just mentioned, the other includes or tracked AHA ads that mention political history anywhere in the listing. That includes the so-called, or what I would call the kitchen sink ads that sort of list we want one person who might specialize in any number of a dozen fields. And there's no mention in any of the conversations here that they're using a different methodology. They don't discuss or interrogate their methodological choices and pose a question as to whether their choices make more sense in the analysis of this question than our own. And so I would say that to assess our data, you need to be open and careful in looking at the evidence and honest about what it shows and what it doesn't show and what we can learn from it. It also looks differently depending on how you drill into the data. For example, if you drill into the data on academic specializations, you'll find that fully 1/4 of all political historians today are emeritus. And actually 1/3 are either emeritus or part-time or contingent. So, and I would say that we still got it right. So since our panel, since our op-ed, we got additional data graciously from the AHA. We've been examining it. And during the past 10 years, the AHA has advertised, I was blown away to discover this, 4,000 tenure track or assistant professor jobs. 4,000 in these terrible times. And of these, just 27 listed political history as the one desired field of expertise. That's well under 1%. Now, you can broaden that criteria lots of ways, and if you choose the most broad definition of any ad that mentions political history anywhere, we still find it's less than 3% of all ads for full-time tenure-track positions. So the job market may be bad, but it's not that bad, and we as a community of scholars are making decisions about what we really think is important, and the hiring might not be the only window into the state of political history. It's definitely not, and it may not be the most important, but it does provide a window into our collective priorities. And even though things are good things are going on in research and research, the fact remains that we as a community may not have demonstrated that political history is one of our priorities. And so finally, the ugly. Here's where things get messy. Many commentators have rightly celebrated the fact that the sphere of what constitutes the political has expanded in our work. And I don't need to tell people in this room that there's valuable and insightful scholarship looking at politics from all kinds of angles. Our point is not to denigrate or undervalue this work, and people who have thought we suggested otherwise are misreading our piece and our intention. Rather, our concern is that embracing these new dimensions, as Fred pointed out, the field may be becoming not more inclusive, but in fact less so. So let me frame this as a question. If you believe that political history is alive and well, does that mean you are satisfied with the quality and quantity of research and teaching on what we loosely describe as high politics? Congress, state governments, presidents, institutions, the goings-ons of political elites. Does this mean that you are confident that graduate students who pursue work in these areas won't be denigrated or ignored for doing work that is outdated or traditional? Now, I say all this is ugly because it gets us into the messy issue of how we define political history, and I suspect this will be part of the conversation today. So I'll just close with 3 related questions that were asked in email exchanges that we had with various people who wrote to us, generally including ones that disagreed with us. Here's 3 questions that were asked to us. First, in arguing for a larger sphere of the political, is the category of political history getting so big that it doesn't mean anything anymore? 2, do young scholars especially have to frame their political histories as cultural and social histories in order to get our colleagues to think they are important, their work is important? And 3rd, does the historical profession value political history appropriately, or do you feel it should be valued higher? These are tough questions and they're ugly questions, but Fred and I hope that our op-ed and this panel will help provoke some honest and productive discussion that will help us all achieve our shared goal of helping students and the people around us develop a rich and meaningful understanding of our complex political past. One only need look to Twitter to see how desperately we need it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So if you weren't familiar with the debate, now you are. And first up to respond is my colleague Leslie Reagan, who teaches in the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Thank you. Good morning. Let's see. I've lost where I am. Well, of course, I didn't know the comments, and I've now lost track. So I'm obsessed with politics and elections myself. I'd been reading, listening, watching as much as I could manage or stomach of the 2016 campaign, and this op-ed, of course, caught my eye. And I want to both respond to these remarks as well as the actual op-ed that I read. And the author's central argument that political history was not being taught as they defined it, and Antoinette has quoted it for us, I regard it as simply incorrect. It is still taught, and I think they were perhaps looking in the wrong places, looking for titles of the courses. And using my department as an example, and I'm sure yours as well, do we have a class called U.S. Political History? No. Where would students learn it? In the introductory U.S. History course, which would be the largest possible courses in our department, students will always be learning about voting, party realignment, elections, presidents. Indeed, I sometimes am surprised myself with how much attention I give these, quote, traditional topics. Public policy includes the Civil Rights Acts 19th century and 1964, as well as the failure of elected officials to act on AIDS. Students also learn a great deal of political history in the history of medicine class. Efforts to win national health insurance from the Progressive era through Truman to Obama, the Shepard-Towner Act, Jim Crow, and more. Where else might this type of traditional political history, on their terms, be found? In courses on Illinois history, war and society, U.S. women's history, African American history, early America, American Revolution, and many others, including global history and Europe and everything else. Why don't we offer a specialized course in U.S. political history? We used to, nor do we offer a course on the Civil War. Is this because, as asserted, the profession or my department specifically no longer cares about political history? Because we have all shifted to the history of, quote, African Americans, Latinos, women, homosexuals, and environmental activists? No. The professor who was our designated and beloved political historian retired 4 years ago. Our Civil War historian retired last year. The history department has put U.S. political history at the top of its list of hiring priorities for several years. U.S. political history, U.S. Civil War, and U.S. women's history are top priorities. Political history is number one. Our big problem is the attack on the public university and public education in general. With the state cutting funds to the public university to less than 10%, it might be 5%, and a new billionaire governor dedicated to destroying social services, there is virtually no hiring at all. Assuming that we someday will be able to hire a political historian, she or he may or may not create courses with titles that Logevall and Osgood will count as legitimate political history courses. Come to think of it, I'm not even sure that our political historian met their expectation of teaching the value of compromise. I doubt that was Mark Leff's highest priority. His popular courses focused on political intolerance, McCarthyism, and how Americans could be deceived into supporting war. I'm sure those are important to you as well. But compromise, don't think that was his most important tool or skill. When we get to the author's analysis of why political history has declined, I'm very happy to hear what you've said in your remarks about your understanding of the breadth of political history, and that actually your point was not to denigrate. However, I don't accept that people have misread the op-ed, because when I read it closely, what I see is a conflation of the kinds of history and method and the specific groups of people who are seen as the source of the problem. Perhaps it was a miswriting or a misediting in the op-ed. The authors say the trend began in the 1960s. Activists brought a new emphasis on history from the bottom up. According to the authors, the long overdue diversification of the Academy also fostered changing perspectives, as a field once dominated by middle-class white males opened its doors to women, minorities, and people from working-class backgrounds. Recovering the lost experiences of these groups, understandably, became priority number one. These transformations enriched the national story, but they also carried costs, end quote. Now, this would be useful to learn the history of our profession. Universities and the discipline of history did not so much open its doors, quote, as have its doors forced open by each of those groups. White working class men entered in large numbers after World War II, thanks to the GI Bill. And the complaints of the professoriate about those working class white students and then professors concerning their intelligence, their skills, their work habits, their culture, were much like those 25 years later when social movements, federal law, and affirmative action programs forced universities to admit and hire women and people of color as students and faculty. Those same social movements and students demanded and fostered the social and cultural history that the authors deem enriching but costly, like frosting on the cake. Now, okay. Those of us who research and teach what they consider to be mere frosting would argue they've got it backwards. The cake of political history cannot be understood or told without social movements, sexuality, racial injustice, and all the rest. The idea that one could study elections without investigating the real lives of all the voters in their complicated, contradictory diversity is utterly silly. But maybe they've already conceded this. So I won't go into, obviously, what we need to know in the past election in terms of reality TV, the economics of news, the history of white supremacy and sexual harassment, the monetary value of whiteness and male privilege, and the politics of pantsuits. Now, quote, these transformations enriched the national story, but they also carried costs. That, quote, they refers to the new, now old social history, and they, the previously excluded people who entered the academy, women, minorities, and people from working class backgrounds. It's not just the topic or methods, it's the people. And frankly, I'm not sure that the writers find scholarship on women, minorities, and the working class enriching. Everything about the piece suggests that they deem this research to be less important than the type of political history that matters to them, and that they feel the same way about the people who have been excluded. I mean, part of the anger and that people felt was that the authors sound much alike the disaffected white males who appealed to Mr. Trump throughout the campaign, who entered the academy, although I'm willing to assume that that's not what they meant to do.
Those are kind of insulting comments. I'll just.
Well, that's how people felt.
Okay. And you got no.
I have 0. Okay. That's not where I wanted to end.
We continue.
That's not where I wanted to end.
Sentence at the end. And no. Okay.
Yeah, I just closed it. I mean, I think the value is for us to be teaching about the value of public education, progressive tax systems, which we can be doing in every class, every meeting, every conference, every op-ed, and not attacking our own discipline and demanding only one type of political history. And it's very disturbing to have our discipline attacked. That's what
Thank you. Okay. Great. Okay. Hope we're getting all this on tape. Next up, Marsha from Mississippi.
That's how it was read.
Good morning. Logevall and Osgood's op-ed resonated with me because it reflected some of my experiences in graduate school and a trend in the historical profession that I observed personally. To begin, I'll share an anecdote. A few years ago, I attended a conference panel on the state of political history. The room was jam-packed, which highlighted the fact that many historians are interested in and thinking about political history. While sitting in the audience, however, I noticed that while all the historians were working on political history and sought to answer political questions, none of them mentioned elected officials, party politics, or the work of policymaking at the state or national level. I appreciated that the historians were focused on grassroots activism and local community studies, but I thought it was strange that the panel did not include anyone who worked on elections, party politics, and policy generation in DC. While the panel's composition might be merely a reflection of the interests of the person who planned it, or logistics, I thought it reflected a trend I noticed that many historians still have an aversion to high politics, or we call high politics, and political history that might resemble the histories of elites of an earlier era that excluded the vast majority of Americans. I wasn't surprised by the panel because I had not met many historians in graduate school who were interested in political history as it relates to elected politicians and party politics. I had met many people over the years who were surprised by my interest in political history, perhaps in part because of my race and gender, but also because I was writing a dissertation on a governor and Republican Party politics. While preparing for this panel, I considered whether I should talk about the job market as a historian who graduated in 2014, whether or how I teach political history courses at Mississippi State University, or how to teach students in a way that encourages them to be socially and politically engaged. If anyone is interested, I will be happy to talk about those topics during the Q&A. Ultimately, I decided to share my experiences in graduate school to answer in part the question of what types of political history we are teaching. To give you a sense of my perspective on this topic, I'll share a little about my research interests. I am working on a manuscript about Nelson Rockefeller, moderate republicanism, racial politics, and Rockefeller's policy generation as governor of New York. As for graduate school, it's not that my graduate courses did not engage with politics and political history, by any means. Political history could be found in the social, cultural, and urban history that I was reading. But I think we were only assigned 1 or 2 books that engaged with policymaking and party politics on a national scale, particularly regarding 19th and 20th century US history. Some would say that isn't a problem, but when I decided that I needed a grounding in presidential and congressional politics to understand better the political questions I was thinking about, I realized that I would not get that in my courses. I ended up taking an independent study in presidential history and policy generation from FDR to Reagan. The experience gave me a great appreciation for the value in an extended, in-depth focus on high politics, elections, and policymaking that I didn't get in my graduate courses up until that point. I would never argue that this type of history is the most important or that it should supersede other types of history. A great deal of my interest in high politics was inspired by my interest in African American and urban history. But I would say that this type of political history was somewhat lost in my graduate program. I still remember my classmates in my cohort seeming just surprised that I would make the strange decision to take an independent study on presidents. I don't believe my experience is that unusual, however. This is the reason that I was happy to see the op-ed in the New York Times and the conversation it created, whether people agreed or disagreed. Political history in all forms is relevant to people of all backgrounds. Whether it is top-down or from the bottom up, it can be written in an inclusive way, and I think the more that political historians write and teach political history in that way, it will be embraced by students at all levels. Thank you.
And then now, Michael, are you going to come up here? Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for showing up. I've never been at a better attended Sunday morning AHA panel. I'm very, very thankful to Marsha for her comments, because I think, we have a problem of false dichotomies here, I think, which, I think we should face a little bit. Epistemologically, I think it should be a truism for people who care about political history that high politics and other kinds of politics are connected. How can they not be? Politics is about power, and power is about, lots of different subjects which involve ordinary people in all kinds of ways, as well as powerful people. We have a state and we have a people, or rather peoples, and both have always mattered, and their interactions will always matter, have always mattered. So just get that out of the way first. But I think that Fred and Ken did a great service to the profession by starting an argument. Arguments are good things, I think. I'm the editor of a little left-wing magazine, Dissent, where we can do the thing we enjoy most doing is starting arguments. So I always enjoy a good argument. I think they're important in politics and in scholarship as well. And I think they're right that many aspects of high politics are neglected or tended to only when they come into contact with subjects that since the 1960s we have learned to care about very deeply, and rightfully so. Race, gender, class, sexuality, social movements, transnational, intellectual relationships, and so forth. My own institution, Georgetown, which is, of course, in the nation's capital, where there's no way to escape politics, even if you would like to. We have currently no historian of the American Revolution or the Constitution, and no historian of the Civil War. We had a historian of the Civil War, but she had to move on to a different place, a non-academic job. So that leaves me and a couple other people as political historians, which is fine, but I wouldn't deign to teach the Constitution. And I think that to zero in on the kind of political history I think does get neglected. Teaching and scholarship, I think, in different degrees, is the history of institutions, political institutions specifically. American Political Development School, which probably a lot of you know about, has done a wonderful job, actually, doing research on institutions like Congress, like the courts, like the federal bureaucracy. But they do it as political scientists, and we know about model building and quantification, and even though they're very historically attuned, some wonderful historians from that school, Theda Skocpol, wonderful social scientists from that school, Theda Skocpol, Stephen Skoranek, and many others, people probably familiar with. But they don't believe in the empirical richness that we do, and they keep trying to predict things. So just to name a few of the institutions I think do get neglected by historians, and I neglect it myself in a lot of my teaching, in part because there aren't good sources for me to draw on by historians. The evolution of the federal courts, the power of federalism. My good friend Gary Gerstle wrote a wonderful book recently published called Liberty and Coercion, which is a history of the American state, where he talks about the relationship of the development of the American state, how it was constrained by the Constitution because of how important federalism is in the Constitution, but also how those who ran the state tried to get around that in various ways, and how federal power really only took over from state power, at least provisionally, in the 1960s, and that was because of social movements pressing on those who ran the state. The changing role of Congress, as someone was mentioning, Marsha, I think, mentioned it. How many historians of Congress can you mention? I can't mention more than 2 or 3. I won't give names right now, given the time. Histories of voting. Alex Kesar, as most of you know, wrote a wonderful history of voting. Took him many, many years to write it. But otherwise, the history of voting is dominated by journalists, very good journalists, but not many historians really look at that. You ask historians to talk for 5 minutes, right? So, and if we needed any reminder of how important it is to understand high politics, well, something which happened just 2 months ago, November 8th, which, as other people have mentioned, probably most of us obsessed about the elections, even if you weren't a political historian. And I found that my students, who don't come to Georgetown, for the most part, wanting to learn about political history, actually. They come to Washington, they care about politics, but they don't, flock to courses on political history necessarily. They kept asking me questions that I, had to, as a political historian, I thought I knew about, but I had to go back and do some study on. For example, why the Electoral College was created in the first place. I said, I'm not a historian of the Constitution, and why it endures, and how difficult it would be to change it, and what a better system might be. How primaries came to dominate the nomination process in both parties. Arguments about whether unrestricted campaign spending should be protected by the First Amendment or not. Vital questions of our politics that, as a political historian, I really had to do go back, look in the articles in the political encyclopedia I edited to remember. With my 30 seconds that I have left, let me just paraphrase a famous quote, once famous quote by Leon Trotsky, he said, you may not care about the dialectic, but the dialectic cares about you. I would say you may not care about high politics, but high politics cares about us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So this is great. We have a lot of time to have conversation. I hope we will. We've heard some really interesting points raised about the relationship between research and teaching, about the relationship between methods and objects of inquiry, between a lot of good, bad, and uglies. So with that, I'll open up the floor. If you could, when you ask your question, stand up and say who you are and where you're from. I think that would be really helpful. Yes.
Gus Seligman, University of North Texas. I think we're kind of schizophrenic in some ways about political history. I teach 2 political history courses, unabashedly political history. One is the history of U.S. political parties. The other is the history of presidential elections. Now, I think most of the people would admit that both of those are kind of important topics. But try and find readings at a reasonable cost for those courses. Whitcover and Lou Gould are both out of print. I tried to find something for presidential elections. Nothing exists. I suggested I do it. I was told there's no market. Now, are these important courses? Are these important topics? Or am I just a dinosaur?
Response? Should I collect a few more questions, or Ken, would you like to respond?
Well, I just thank you for sharing your story. Since you allowed me the mic, let me just apologize for interjecting during Leslie's comments. That was intemperate of me. Although sort of being labeled in the same sentence with a social movement that's connected to racism and xenophobia and really atrocious behavior in so many ways. I found that offensive, but I apologize for interjecting that way. I would also just like to take this opportunity to respond quickly to three statements that Leslie made in her comments. That political history can't be taught without social movements, et cetera. Absolutely, totally get it. We don't need to be convinced of that, and we don't anywhere say that or have never asserted it. I'm actually working on a research project right now that's about political history of social movements as generated by propaganda campaigns. We're not demanding anywhere that only one type of political history be taught, that it only be high politics, etc. We don't suggest or say that anywhere, and never have. Nor do we say or believe that we don't value social or cultural history. Fred's work, his first book, is the concept of gender is important to his ultimate analysis. My work includes race, class, and gender in all its in its analysis, and I assign Howard Zinn to my students, for crying out loud. So the notion that I denigrate or don't value those scholars is absurd. And again, we don't say that anywhere, and wouldn't say it. And it hurts that those views are attached to us. The views of others are attached to us based on positions that we don't make.
So I understand completely the interruption and the upset. And I'm pleased to hear that you actually have these views and you don't have any problem at all with cultural and social history. I really was analyzing the op-ed as I read it, and closely, and the more I read closely, the way the words were put together. And it's incendiary going back and forth, and I really had questions about whether I wanted to do a panel at all, whether I thought it was a good idea to persist in this. And I hear this, but I think that then saying this is a misreading is to again put it back on people's response that what they're seeing here is an attack or what they feel. So we don't have to continue on that way, but perhaps you should listen to some of the people who felt that this was a way of denying work, or some of the people who've entered the profession, and that they hear this kind of subtle dismissiveness or lack of respect on a regular basis over decades that people deny. And so that's part of what comes back. And also what I heard you saying was that what this op-ed is really about is what Fred here said, if you don't mind first name,
Not at all.
that the field is not inclusive, we shouldn't have to apologize, it should be welcoming and more inclusive. And so that really so much of this is about how we feel, whether we feel like we're welcome and what the definition of the discipline is. And I find this to be very, very common, right, among historians, that as our fields shift and we get more senior, sometimes, I mean, I've observed it among, with Gerda Lerner as she's at the top of the field. She defined it, and she wasn't happy about where it went. That we are often not happy about that. And we feel left out in some way, even if we are at the absolute top. But we don't all get to write and get those feelings and sentiments published in the New York Times for the world to see historians battling it out. So I will stop. Yes,
Can I just
continue?
I'm sorry. So I think we should very much open this up to the
Yes,
floor. And
that's exactly
the
right.
gentleman in the front row deserves
Yes.
an answer to his question. But I do want to say, Leslie,
Yes.
that if we had time, I would like for you to quote from the op-ed those passages that say or imply that we think there should be only one kind of political history. That imply, yes, indeed, you did. And in the conclusion to your opening remarks, you said more than once, in fact, that Ken and I feel that history should be done in one way and only in one way. And there's not even an implication of this. I don't know where this is coming from. In response to you, sir, I think that the thrust of your question is a very good one, and I commend you for the courses that you're teaching. I can hear the frustration that you have in terms of finding the appropriate readings. I find, and again, I want to underscore that there is great research being done by fellow academic historians pertaining to political history, no question about it. And again, I assign it to my students, but I also will say that on some of the things that we've been discussing here today, and some of the things that Michael talked about in his remarks, I do find that I recommend to students who ask for readings work by excellent non-academic historians. I find, from my own perspective, that too often I tell them about Rick Perlstein, you should read Jeff Cabaservice, you should read Robert Caro, and it just suggests to me that we as academics, academic historians, including in courses suitable for course use, could be doing a better job. That's what I would say.
Can you make a comment?
Yeah, please.
Just real quick. Good.
Yeah, here.
I want to say, Professor Seligman, thank you for your comment. Honestly, I would enjoy teaching a class on U.S. elections if I had the opportunity, but actually I was hired to teach African American history, and that's what I teach at the undergraduate level. And something that your comment maybe sort of highlighted for me is the fact that I think many of our students are not getting enough of any type of history. Right? So I teach the majority of my students are African American, and they attend my African American history courses, and they are often upset that this is the first time in their life that they've ever heard anything about Black history beyond Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. And they're really grateful to have an African American history course instead of a U.S. history course. I think that it's not that these students should only take African American history, but I think their sort of concern speaks to the fact that they're not getting a lot of different types of history, right? And they're both important. They have their place, and that sort of your comment spoke to, or sort of reminded me of that as well. So I just wanted to mention that. And I think their concern shows that there's still a need for more African American history about Latinos, Asians, many other groups, and they don't necessarily get that in their surveys, but there's only so much you can do when you're trying to teach a U.S. survey and try to give everyone their due. So.
Yeah, real quick. Whoops. I mean, again, I keep thinking it's people talking false dichotomy, but I think, one of the fields of political history that I think shows the kind of things that can really be done, this is sort of a happy talk moment here, is what's happened with history of conservatism over the last 25 years. I wrote pat myself on the back, I wrote a review essay on American conservatism in 1992 in the AHR, and a lot of people said, American conservatism, that's an interesting thing to study. Why would anybody write about that? And over the last 25 years, that's not a problem anymore. And those best histories, and some are by very, very good journalists like Rick Perlstein, but many are by very good historians like Lisa McGurr and many others, have really, I think, enriched our understanding of high politics and social movements and ideologies and the law. So in many ways, of course, most people writing these histories are not themselves conservatives, but because there aren't that many conservatives in our profession, as you know, especially in the U.S. side of things. But I think that is the example of, from my point of view, the kind of history, political history that should be done more of, as well as the stuff I mentioned in my remarks.
So there's a couple of folks who are been waiting to ask questions. Some in the back here, and you wrote in the front. So please state your name and where you're from.
So I'm Matt Sutton from Washington State University. I'm curious, Fred and Kenneth, part of the problem is just the genre of the op-ed. That when somebody else chooses your headline and you only have 800 words, you are not going to make a room this size of the stories happy no matter what. I'm curious if you could respond to that and being part of the issue.
It's certainly the case, and boy did we feel it in the aftermath. And even allowing for that 800-word minimum, and the editor was quite firm on this. I've published a few in the past, and I thought, we can stretch it to 1,000. He'll let us have 1,050. In this case, he was just ruthless. And I think the problem here was, and I think we talked a little bit about this the other night here, we could have been a little bit more vigilant, the two of us, in saying that we wanted him to to send the proposed title to us prior to publication. I think he would have. But we didn't know what the title was going to be. We also didn't know he was going to have a photograph, much less a photograph of Arthur Schlesinger and John F. Kennedy, which gives the piece, even for anybody, especially a room like this, it gives a sense, okay, it's one of those. So yes, 800 words, as we say in the perspective piece, which I hope you'll read if you haven't read it. It's a useful exchange in the current issue of Perspectives. We say it's hard to do nuance in 800. I don't know, Ken, if you want to add anything.
Oh, just as a footnote, I don't know if you even remember, we went through about 25 different drafts over the course of a month.
Oh boy, do I remember.
But our first draft actually began with a reference to historians against Trump, and was much more rooted in a perception that, watching this mess unfold before our eyes, that we wanted, or we felt a powerful need to speak now, in the sense because we were watching an electorate, a range of commentaries that were woefully ignorant of basic things about American politics, and certainly basic things about American political history. And what motivated us to a great degree was a sense that we as a community, we need to do our part here to help our students understand this political universe, because they're going to be the next generation of teachers. And somewhere along the line, we failed them, and we need to address that.
Do you want to say anything more about the genre of the op-ed, or do you feel that was addressed?
Well, the only way to reach a public audience is to be popular, and a lot of historians are reaching a public audience. That's what you did.
So then, you have a question?
My name's Tom Lauder with the University of Memphis, PhD student. My area of emphasis is civil military diplomacy for U.S. When you talk about political history, one of the things from the advisors I have at my university is suggest you go look at the political science department, look at the international relations department. They do push me to teach in those areas. We're seeing a shifting of political history moving into the political science departments and international relations departments. And are we missing that component when we're discussing history in general?
I think there is a trend in that direction. You see it at other universities as well. And I know that at my current institution, this is a tiny statistical sample, so I don't know how useful this is, but certainly students have said, who have an interest, have felt that they should go to the government department to see what might be available there. There's a related point that I would make, which is that our I guess it's DUS, Director of Undergraduate Studies in my department, told us something interesting a few weeks ago, a couple months ago in a faculty meeting, which is that they had done a student survey. And I don't know if they were history concentrators, as it's called, or history majors, or if it's just general students. But what the students indicated in this survey was two things. One is that they like courses that deal with, among other things, not exclusively these courses, but they like courses that deal with major human events, that deal with leaders, that deal with issues of war and peace, and secondly, that they felt that the department doesn't offer enough of these courses. So we had an interesting discussion then in the meeting, and I hope we have more, about the curriculum. But it does suggest that there is a hunger here. And I would say one other thing, I have a joint appointment. So in my appointment at the Kennedy School, I allow I have slots for undergraduates to take the course in addition to Kennedy School students. And those undergraduates have said it's a self-selecting group, but one of the reasons they're drawn, maybe this goes to your question too, one of the reasons they're drawn to Kennedy School classes, not just government department classes, is because they find those courses there.
Can you say a little bit about the state of that shift for you?
Yes, well, I think what you see is, like at the University of Memphis, we do a lot of social, cultural history. Egyptology is one of the big areas for our history department. And when you see the course listings, I mean, that's one of the things with graduates and students, when we're looking at, okay, what's being offered. We focus heavily on, okay, here's what the history department's offering. And then luckily we've got good graduate advisors to say, hey, look at the science department, review things that will match your coursework, international relations. But when we start talking about the course offerings, then again, you go to the competition for what the student body is looking for. And the other aspect is when you have professors that are retiring, whether or not you're going to be able to backfill them because of just the internal university politics. So you start seeing that loss of potential scholarship for political history or genres.
I guess I was also wondering whether you think that if you're directed toward government or political science, whether history drops out in those domains, whether there's a vicinity of behavioral kind of analysis, that would sort of begin to address where history lives, if it lives at all in the.
Well, I think at least in my area, they're pushing me to where the experts are because they don't have expertise in the department anymore. So when you have they go to emeritus status or you have them go to different career opportunities, you lose that strength in the department. So you're trying to push the people to where you get at least the benefit of some of these expertise. They may not be a perfect fit or match, but at least they'll be able to drive in that direction.
The question of expertise is really an important one. My review also kind of great that you need expertise for Constitution because you're not an expert in that. Yeah, you can wait.
Spencer Leonard, I teach at the University of Virginia, and I'm a historian of South Asia. First of all, I'll say that American historians have been really good. That the lack of awareness, for instance, chestnut problems like I guess I would challenge Leslie on the notion of what the takeaway from the 2016 election is. Because to me, those were Democratic Party talking points.
Those are what, I'm sorry?
They were Democratic Party talking points in terms of white supremacy and the long legacy of that. To me, the issue, as a founding editor of a leftist magazine, is the way in which this was the first election in the history of my life that, and I'm in my mid-40s, that really raised the question of the party political organization of our politics in a really profound way. Whether it was the primaries, whether, I think someone yesterday said in the panel on the 2016 election, that Trump somehow took power despite the Republican Party, rather than talking about how to go. And of course, the Sanders campaign really raised that issue for a generation of young leftists. Is the Democratic Party, because they're framing it as the background of the new social movements. And in fact, leaving the Democratic Party as a way in which the left can take power is the main question that I think leftists in particular have come to revisit with respect to the 2016 election. And it was actually in the public discourse. Light the day of the Democratic Party as our leftist people deal.
So we've accumulated quite a few questions. I'd kind of like to get them out and then people can respond. We've got one here, one back here. Anybody? Oh, well, I'm sorry. You were next, and then you, and then go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mark Peterson. I am a professor at UC Berkeley. I happen to be the chair of the department at the moment, and so relationship with teaching to the Berkeley department is a major part of my concern. I want to make a comment and ask a specific question. The comment is this. So among the courses that I routinely teach are the U.S. Survey and a course on the American Revolution, which focuses on the Constitution as well. And one of the first things I do in both of those courses, in fact, most courses that I teach, is to ask my students, almost all of them from California, if they can name their U.S. congressperson, their state representative, their state senator, and the numbers of people taking up that first one are small and they get diminishingly smaller. And then I ask them questions like, do you know how many people your congressperson represents? Or your state senator, or your state representative? They never know that answer. I ask them to guess. Some say for like the state representatives or state senators, 50,000, 100. Well, in California, every state senator represents 50 people. Every state represents 500,000. Every congressperson in this country represents about 700,000. I ask them if any of them has ever met any of these people. And usually a couple of hands go up because they were like an intern, for their state reps. So those are the few people who know the names and that sort of thing. And then I ask if they ever wanted to meet these people, how do you think it would happen? And eventually a hand goes up sheepishly and says, well, I was really rich, maybe? Or along those lines, right? And so I think one of the things this speaks to is not so much from the academy, but from the actual world we live in, an incredible distancing of the American populace.
Yes.
And I'm talking about pretty privileged kids, right? UC Berkeley, they got in, right? They've already cleared a high bar from the world of high politics. And so the thing I kind of worry about in this whole conversation is the siloing, right? This suggestion that somehow high politics, presidents, Congress, etc., are a separate subject or distanced from, all of the kinds of things that some of the panelists have talked about here. And so when I hear this idea that there's not enough of that kind, it makes me concerned that you say, well, let's go back and do more of that kind. Again, there's always cost.
Civics education.
It's going to reinforce that sort of siloing idea in a way that I find unfruitful for my own students. And so when I teach, I don't fancy myself a political historian exactly, but in every one of these subjects, we're always connecting, events on the ground. And my colleagues do the same sort of thing, writing books starting with the specifics of life among the Comanches and the High Plains and ending up with the causes of the Mexican War.
Exactly.
Right? And so I really would kind of like to hear more about ways in which we can think about configuring the academy that, you know, doesn't necessarily leave people looking for a particular specialty, you know, feeling bad or not feeling respected for what they're doing, but really promoting a way so that our students can understand how these things are all always intimately connected. So to that end, here's the question that finishes off. You said 3%, right? That was the number you came up with the people self-identifying as political historians. Was that American or?
Oh, no, that was not. That was in terms of job advertisements. So that was not the percentage of.
The implication I took from that was that that's a small number. But is it? Did you actually ask like what other specialties and how many identified in that and you have a breakdown? I don't know, right? And it would be interesting to hear some analysis of whether 3 is little or big or
that's a good question.
Where you think that belongs in the great vast array of different kinds of specialties that historians do.
Good question.
Let's accumulate 2 more questions. We got one here and then one back here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marsha. I'm an assistant professor at the Miller Center, which is a think tank at UVA, and a columnist for Vox and U.S. News. And I'll keep this short because I'm not sure if it's a comment or a question, but mentioning Jeff Cottaservice as a non-academic historian, he has his PhD from Yale. And I think that actually gets to the bigger problem, which is that I'm part of a cohort of young political historians who can't find jobs in the academy, and so we write these first books that I think have been really important. You're not going to get a second Cottaservice book because he doesn't have that kind of institutional support. And so I think that this begins to get at the institutional problem of political history, which is that absent that institutional support, we move into think tanks and into journalism because we can't find a place at the academy. And I think that that's the thing that resonated with me most in the op-ed is that you do have tons of young political historians, but they're not going to be academic historians. And that's going to be a problem that builds over time, especially with that lost generation.
Okay, one more question, then we'll finish.
Someone had a question back too.
Yeah, the woman in the red.
Right here, and then something back. Yeah.
The woman in the red has her hand up for like an age.
Comment as a graduate student. We addressed that yet. So I am a political historian and a Rutgers like Marsha. And I very much come from a tradition of approaching political history from women and gender history and bottom-up history, and I think my scholarship has been massively enriched by that. So I'm going to be a typical millennial and talk about the malaise of the flip side generation, the baby boomers. But I would say that in my classrooms there was a real resistance to studying political history, which I think is about partly a reflection of how the field is placed and how it's taught. And I think it's a lot of the choices that professors have to make about teaching how the field has evolved. So they want to capture where it began and where it is now. But often, for instance, we would study, there'd be like almost an insurrection where we had to read David Potter's The Impending Crisis, which like I personally enjoyed, but everybody else in the class hated. But in analogous fields like labor history that have been through similar processes, students are so receptive to Seth Rothman's Scraping By. So I think there is a way, and Lisa McGurr's new book is a good example where students have been more receptive to thinking about high politics when it's done in a way that is blended with other types of history. But that said, I also really feel what Professor Reagan said is that whenever I go to conferences, I'm introduced as a women and gender historian and not a political historian, and I notice that, and for the jobs that I'm applying for, if I win the lottery and get a job, it's likely to be women and gender history and not in political history. So as someone on the market, I definitely feel like there are a lot of jobs out there in political history or overtly in political history. Maybe more so than there are in religious history, but it's way down there on the list of job ads that you notice for a whole lot of systemic reasons. So that's kind of my experience as someone who considers themselves a political historian. I don't always get labeled that way, and I do generally notice that my graduate classmates that study environmental history or the history of girlhood are resistant to political history, but I think in some way that does reflect that high political history hasn't been integrated yet, and the works that women and gender historians or African American historians are producing are often not called political history.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I have 2 quick comments and a question. Christina Ferrari, teacher at City. The comment was just to sort of flag and 2 things that Leslie administration, they're not part of the departments are allowed. And the second brief comment, I would just note that I don't think this issue of whether the language of the op-ed is actually settled. It read to me very similarly to the way that it read to Leslie, regardless of the intention. But the question is, I think there's actually a conflation here. I am very persuaded by those of you who are working in political history that they can feel that your research is not necessarily being taken seriously, or that there aren't jobs. I'm very persuaded there. I'm not persuaded at all that this is a problem in teaching arena. I think many of us who don't teach courses that are necessarily described as political history are nonetheless doing that. I'm a British historian. I talk more about Rome than I can like things that happen to happen. So I wonder if we could perhaps separate these two issues. I think one is very salient and the other not much so.
Okay, we've got a host of rich comments if people like to respond. Michael, were you holding on to response?
Well, I mean, there's so many things. I'll make a few comments. Whoops.
I'm going to have to run out the door. I'm going to have to run out the door.
All right, we'll let Michael
Unless you can do 1 minute, yeah. Okay.
Oh, go first. Go.
I hate to jump in, but I'm going to have to run out the door for a flight, which has nothing to do with anybody here. I'm sorry. Although I kind of think you summed it up. This is what I was trying to get at the beginning of my comments, is your concern, the professor from Berkeley, the distancing. And I think there's many ways into that we bring politics in by going to people's interests in many places. And I've seen it with my own interest in medicine and gender, is that you begin in one place and then you end up discovering the importance of, the most reputable and important doctors that you could care less, you thought you didn't care about, or you end up doing elections and political parties because it matters to what you're doing on something else, and then you're teaching about it. And so that political history is in places that maybe other political historians don't even realize it's there, and that it's being taught, which is what your point was. And maybe that's all I have to say at this moment, and I'll let you continue. But thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for participating in this.
A few quick things. First of all, people talk about the job situation. I mean, it's almost as if we're scavenging in the garbage heap, because obviously we know there's a humanities crisis, and you think we're having problems. Talk to people in philosophy departments, English departments. I mean, it's they're. And my grad students, I don't know about you all, but people come to study with me and other people in my department because they care about political history. And the first question I ask them is, do you really love this enough to be poor for 10 years or more and maybe never find a job doing this? And I hate to put them up against the wall that way, but it's honest, So that's important to understand that context. All of us who have jobs, many of our grad students will not have them. That goes to your comment, I think. And that's not just true for political history either, of course. The other thing is, in my department, maybe I don't think this is unusual, political history is alive and well as transnational history and the history of empire, which is, and that goes to some way you were talking about, military stuff. And so there's a lot of my fellow people in my department have joint appointments in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, which actually the history department used to be part of the School of Foreign Service, and then it separated itself about 25 years ago before I got there. But and so most students at Georgetown take courses in political history, but it's called the history of empire or international relations or and so forth. And so there's lots of courses on that. It's really national political history that is, I think, withering for the most part, and that's an important distinction, I think. And one just final comment, and this goes, I think, to comment about Berkeley, I think, and students there. And what they think about politicians and politics. And there's a lot of cynicism, of course, in the American public, as we know in general, about parties, about politicians. I don't want to open the floodgates in 10 minutes left to talk about, why Donald Trump got elected, but clearly the fact he was seen as not a politician was very important to a lot of people who voted for him. And just to finish my comments with a bit of an insult about somebody who can't answer me because he's dead, someone mentioned Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a great propagandist, but a terrible historian. And I wrote a critical piece about him years ago, which when he was alive to answer it. But I think it's also the fact that he's very popular, that the book gets taught in high schools in many parts of the country, is both cause and result of the fact that people are very cynical about politics. Because for Howard Zinn, all politicians, unless they're Eugene Debs, were frauds, corrupt, people who just wanted power for its own sake and nothing else. And that is one of the things which has an impact, I think, on our students.
How did he respond when you wrote it?
He thought he said, I just focus on the people. Other people can focus on the powerful, which in some ways goes to some of the things we discussed today. But of course, he had a point of view about the powerful.
I guess in reference to in response to the question about teaching political history, I think we are definitely teaching political history in our survey courses. I integrate it into my courses on African American history. Like for example, every semester in my AFAM history survey, I teach John Dittmer's chapter, Local People and National Leaders, The View from Mississippi, right? And you have Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and their responses to the civil rights movement, and specifically in Mississippi. And generally, my students really love it. They've never really read about our presidents in that way, when we're talking about civil rights in Mississippi. But at the same time, if I was teaching a course about policy generation in the 20th century, I would probably spend a couple of weeks talking about the politics of civil rights and the process of creating and passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But I don't have a chance to do that because I don't have that much time in a survey. So I think if I had a political history course that enabled me to have more focus, I think our students might learn more about how policy is created in Washington, and you might lose sight of that a little bit in a survey course. Although at the same time, I often like to focus on civil rights activists as well, because it's a way for students to get a sense of how can they perhaps engage with their government and society around them as well. But I think it's just sort of a question of how much time and space do you have for political history. But again, that's not an issue just for political history. It's sort of what you can do in a survey course. That's just sort of my thoughts when it comes to that question. But yes, we are teaching political history in a lot of different spaces.
I was going to say something very similar, and Marsha said it better. But I take the point in connecting your question and this comment. I take the point that there's a reasonable argument to be made that in fact this is not really a teaching problem, as you said. I don't happen to agree with that assertion, but I can see the argument. I guess one reason I'm skeptical, because I won't repeat what Marsha has just said, which has to do with the amount of sustained attention that you can give to a topic in a class. It seems to me that PhD dissertation, maybe this goes to Nikki's comment a little bit too, PhD dissertations are kind of the foundation for the historiography. PhD dissertations are obviously written by people who will then go on the market and get these jobs. And if, as I happen to believe, the kinds of politics that we're talking about here, people are being actively discouraged from pursuing, or perhaps they pursue them, and then it's very, very difficult, even allowing for a tough job market to begin with. It's even harder to penetrate that job market if you've chosen that sort of an approach for a dissertation, which is, by the way, why I've discouraged for 20 years students from pursuing these topics. Then it suggests that there's a problem that at some point at least will also influence the courses that are taught, the nature of the courses, and has an effect on the teaching. Ken, I don't know if you wanted to respond on the numbers thing or anything else?
Yeah, I'll speak to that, but first and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, the gentleman from Berkeley. Mark Peterson, thank you. I love how you began your comments sort of talking about, in a very eloquent way, the value or what's taking place is sort of integration of how teaching and work is being done. There's the sort of I think the personal irony of my own journey through to this op-ed is that when I was in graduate school, I was one who was constantly saying how the old lines are breaking down, it's becoming more interesting, and I think that is actually true, and I think it is really valuable how those sort of strict categories now are becoming less meaningful, and I think that's a positive trend, notwithstanding my concern that there are some things that are really missing that we need to do. We're sort of thinking about this question of expertise and depth of expertise. In every course I teach, just about, the African American experience is really important to what I teach my students. It's integrated into much of what I do. But I wouldn't claim to have the kind of expertise needed to really develop students' thinking in that area, to really help them understand some of the complex issues raised by race in the United States. And I think that same sort of analogy also holds true for people who are, yeah, I'm teaching politics in my U.S. survey. Okay, what kind of sophistication, what kind of tools do you have to really do that at the level maybe we need to have? And I think that's an open question there. Then you asked some questions about our data. I would say that the data set we got the AHA job data after we had published the op-ed, so it wasn't available to us beforehand. It's not accessible online. And so that's where those numbers I cited today were. And we're actually still going through it. It's a voluminous and time-consuming activity. So I can only speak impressionistically about the relative strength of political history. And it's very clear that political history is underrepresented, especially if you sort of, depending on how you frame other categories. It's very tricky, goony work. You got to sort of psychoanalyze the job ad, so there's a lot of subjectivity to the whole process. It's not just keyword searching. But it is generally underrepresented. The strongest things that comes across, if you sort of look at sort of political history and some other kinds of history down here, and then African American history is like up here. So that, without even doing any counting, that is clearly an overriding priority of the History Academy right now, based on looking at just percentages of job ads. That's specific.
I guess I wonder about that with respect to the capaciousness and the specificity of the categories. Why is African American history not political history a priori?
Could be or might not be.
Right, and that's what seems like the problem with that analysis, that it defies the very way that the profession has integrated these subspecialties to mask what's really going on.
Yeah, and I think that's the point's well taken, having spent way too much time reading these things. Believe me, I get that. But there is also, I guess I would turn the question around. Would you see someone who fundamentally focuses on the kinds of issues that Fred and I identified? Would these people stand a shot on the job market today? I'm not.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Sullivan from Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and I have two comments and a question. The first comment is, yesterday I was at a panel devoted to periodization of American Indian history. And there the big debate was whether historians of Native Americans give too much or too little weight to what you guys are calling high politics. Right? And I think in a lot of cases, so in other words, I think that Mark's point is right, which is to say that if you're a historian of Native Americans, you can't help but deal with high politics, because issues like sovereignty, issues like territoriality, all of these things deal with high politics at the state level, at the federal level, in some cases the international level. Second comment is, I'm starting a book on the history of Latino voting rights, and I was in the process of doing an NEH proposal when your op-ed came out. And I have to say it was wonderful. It really helped me conceptualize a lot of the things that I needed to put in that proposal. And one of the things that I was thinking about that would really help, I think, address some of the critiques that you've encountered is if you could articulate ways in which high politics can also be inclusive history. Okay, because I think it can, but I don't think, just saying that it can be, if you could show it, if you could give a concrete example or two, I think that would be really helpful. And then the third thing is really a comment, which is one of the other things that I do is I'm involved with the AHA's tuning project. And so I'm interested in you all being able to talk about political history as a way to talk about history as a discipline. So in other words, if you're using political history as a tool to teach about history, like what is it that you want students to know? I'm not talking about content. I'm talking about skills, I'm talking about habits, dispositions unique to the discipline of history that you want students to take away, that you think political history is particularly good for.
I smell AHA panel. Go ahead.
Yeah, I teach at SAIS Europe, and therefore Michael's comments about School of Foreign Service versus History Department or Kennedy School, as Fred was saying, resonate with me. And the problem is, in a way, the opposite, because I'm teaching American foreign policy at SAIS Europe. The bias of the literature, the students' expectations, the material is toward institutional history, is toward Washington-centric history. I teach 2 courses. One of them you might call international history. It's very easy to integrate social questions from Greece, the Greek side at the time of the Civil War, or the Cuban side at the side of the Cuban Revolution, into the discourse of the bilateral relations. The other course I teach in the fall is more about Washington, how Washington operates. It's, the national security institutions of the Constitution. And Fred, I mean, obviously in choosing war, you had to deal with some of these. Who was choosing war? Elites were choosing war, and it was an international discussion. But we make our own history by not in the terms of Jews, so it was conditioned by what was going on. In the period you're writing about, it doesn't quite have to take as much account as it did 2 years later. But I'm interested in your thoughts philosophically about how we might not see that line and say, oh yeah, foreign service schools teach mainly political history to the deficit perhaps of social history, and history departments the other. You at least, have your 2 schools on the same campuses. We don't. We have Baltimore, Washington, Bologna. So I can't really send students to a history department except to a PhD program. So what I'm looking for is, and I think it resonates with what you're saying also, that how we might look to integrate social history from below into the history of American foreign policy without distorting it for the sake of that integration and making it something we should do. I mean, because the premise of the op-ed is that you argue for a more inclusive, more embracive approach, not either one or not one or the other. So.
Okay. We have one thing, sorry, last question back here, and then we're going to let that conclude, and then we got to go. Yeah.
It's not really a question, it's just an observation that builds on what David Oder was just saying, something Fred alluded to. His remarks, this exact conversation, as Ken and Fred know, is happening in other learned societies. It's happening in Schaefer, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and over what is diplomatic history. And that conversation's been going on for the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's happening in the Society for Military History. What is military history? There was a roundtable yesterday morning on precisely this question. What is military history? What does it mean to study war in society? And the same types of questions that we're talking now about. This isn't something that's just about political history. It's about types of history and what's been happening in the academy over the last 30 or 40 years. And they're good conversations to have. They're painful. They're existential. It certainly was existential for a while for Schaefer, diplomatic history. But in the end, they're ultimately, I would say, productive.
Okay, any final words people want to say? If we're Apple time or...
Well, I'll just be very brief. I like this mention. The 2 of you, in a sense, have talked about inclusive history. And I think it's a very useful way to think about this. And I think we can all, if we spent another few minutes here together, we could all think of many examples of people who already are able to do that within a single book. My colleague Lisa Magura has been mentioned. Seems to me that her most recent book on Prohibition is a kind of inclusive history in which you get the importance of history from above and also from below, but there are countless other examples. But it is, I agree, a very helpful way to think about this. I think it underscores, if I speak for Ken, he can correct me, but I think we both feel that, in a sense, that's what this is about for us. And I want to repeat, we were not in any way wanting to be gatekeepers. We wanted to draw attention to something that we think has not been given serious enough attention, even outside the context of a very divisive presidential election and deep polarization in the country. But maybe especially in that context, context, we felt we should talk about this. So, I'm encouraged by this conversation. I don't want this to sound like the very last word, so I'll see if anybody else wants to
Well, I mean, I think I end up more hopeful, actually, after this hour and a half. I mean, I think if Andrew Preston, just talking his book on religion and American foreign policy, is a good example of how you can put together, high politics with something that most Americans cared very deeply about, which is faith. And he goes back and forth between faith communities. You don't call them that, I don't think, but and politicians and diplomats. I think that a lot of us, are doing this sort of back and forth history, you might say, integrating social movements with high politics. I have a new book called War Against War, which is about the opposition to World War I in the United States. And I had to talk about what ordinary Americans thought of the war, and you have to talk about Woodrow Wilson. I mean, it's a war, you can't avoid either side of that. And I think, in fact, returning to what I said in the beginning, let's be aware of false dichotomies, and let's look at and encourage in our students' work, both undergraduates and graduates, the kind of inclusive work which puts together the best of the social history perspective, social movement perspective, you might say, that we know so well over the last 40, 50 years, with these priorities that have always been there. But I don't think there's any reason ever to separate them.
I'll just conclude on a really positive note that I think this has been a fantastic session. I've really helped my own thinking evolve a lot, and I'm really grateful for all the comments in the audience. And I'll also conclude with one footnote. When I assign Howard Zinn, I always pair him with his ideological opposite, Paul Johnson, also a great propagandist, less so a historian. But I use that pairing to fundamentally ask questions about what do we include and what do we not include, what kind of choices do we make, what role do our own convictions have in shaping how we understand the past and stuff like that. And it really opens up students to sort of understanding how the past is constructed, and sort of raises some really cool questions, and it's a fun exercise.
Thank you all. I'm quite serious. As the program chair for 2018, I think there's a ton of interesting program sessions that could come out of this conversation. I have some cards here. I hope you'll contact me if you're interested in organizing something. Please join me in thanking the panelists and also the absent Leslie Reagan. Great session. Thank you.
And Antoinette, you should mention that it's in Washington. So.
We should also thank our moderator, who I think did a fantastic
yes.
job of creating a discussion.